Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Esoteric Literacy. Today we'll discuss the descent of the ages, or cycles of history. Going back in history, there are a few cultures who understood the sort of descent from a golden age toward a dark age that occurs in all civilizations and in these large cycles of time, these very long periods of time. The Greeks, Persians, and Indians kept very good traditions regarding these cycles. We've also heard these cycles in Mesoamerica. In the Greek tradition, Hesiod, in his book called Works and Days, and also another poem called Theogony, he describes how history kind of begins in a golden age, descends into a silver age, descends further into a bronze age, and then into an iron age. And then at the end of an iron age, or the dark age, there'll be a great catastrophe, and time will kind of reset back at a golden age. The Indians also teach this in their Vedic scriptures. If you check out the Vishnu Purana, that's the most explicit scripture that will describe this descent. They call the first age, the golden age, Satya Yuga, which basically means the age of truth. And then that descends into Treta Yuga, then into Dwapara Yuga, and then into Kali Yuga. And Kali Yuga being the dark age. And they describe that at the end of Kali Yuga, Vishnu, the sustainer god or the maintainer god in the Hindu Trimurti, will incarnate as a man named Kalki. And, he'll basically destroy all the wicked people and establish a righteous kingdom, and the cycle of history will begin again at Satya Yuga, or the Golden Age. According to all these traditions, we currently live in the Dark Age, the Iron Age, the Kali Yuga. Some people say we've been living in it since around 10,000 BC. Others say since around 4000 BC. Others will say we've been living in Kali Yuga since around 400 AD. There's really no real math that you can point to. It's all very intuitive and philosophical, whether or not we're actually living in this dark age or when it began and when it's going to end. Some teachers, like Yukteswar Giri and his student Yogananda, claim that at the end of the 19th century, we began leaving Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga ended in the 19th century, and we're descending back into Dwapara Yuga. Now, of course, that would mean that from their point of view, it doesn't just reset to a golden age and begin again. It goes back up from Kali Yuga to Dwapara to Treta, then to Satya Yuga. Or from the Iron Age to the Bronze Age to the Silver Age to the Golden Age in an ascending arc. And then you get like a sine wave of golden ages that go gently up and down in like a progressive mode. Honestly, that's not the traditional way of viewing it. Yukteswar Giri and Yogananda lived in the 19th and 20th centuries. They're very famous spiritual teachers, but they're the only source that I've found that believe in this sort of gradual progression up and down, whereas all of the other sources and ancient scriptures and ancient traditions and ancient oral traditions say it begins at a golden age and then goes down to a dark age and shoots back up to a golden age and starts again, and that there's always a catastrophe at the end of the dark age, and then that leads relatively rapidly to a golden age. Now, relatively rapidly could mean a few centuries, but in the grand scheme of things, that is pretty fast. It's not going to take tens of thousands of years. It's just going to take a few hundred years to get back up to a golden age after some big catastrophe happens. So I guess, we'll have to wait and see if any of this is true, if we do in fact live in Kali Yuga. But you can look around, and the characteristics of Kali Yuga and the Iron Age, as Hesiod calls it, are described, in the Vishnu Purana. The characteristics of these different ages are described, and in Hesiod's Works and Days, he also describes the characteristics. In a golden age, you have basically a properly ordered civilization. According to a philosopher that I like to read called Julius Evola, he's very explicit about what a properly ordered civilization ought to look like, and that is one that is organized from above and organizes itself toward the above. Basically what that means is, you know, there's the spiritual world, which is the above, and the material world, which is below. So the material world and all of our governments and institutions and hierarchies of authority and all that ought to reflect the sort of spiritual hierarchies. So our institutions should reflect like the cosmic ordering of things. And if you can get as close as possible to that, then you're basically living in a golden age. And so what that would mean, especially according to the Vedic tradition and the ideas of Julius Evola, is that you have basically like an avatar who sits atop the throne, like sort of like an emperor or a king. And this person is like extremely enlightened. He has experienced Jivan Mukti, which is, you know, spiritual liberation while you're still alive. It's like becoming enlightened while still being alive. And then you basically become like an avatar of God, like an incarnation of God. And that person is like the pinnacle of human government, and all other things are ordered from that. Beneath this imperial avatar will be an aristocratic class of spiritually enlightened people, people who have had the transcendental spiritual experience in their life. They are sort of like the decision makers for the various institutions and guilds and corporations or whatever. And then beneath them, you'd have like the military class, who is subordinate to these enlightened aristocrats. Beneath the military class, you'd have the merchants, who have to, again, they're subordinated to these two upper castes. And then beneath them, you have basically the common people, who, again, they're encouraged to order their lives based on spiritual principles and not based on other principles. And so you have like a spiritual hierarchy that sort of goes down through the institutions of society, and that's how authority is carried down from the spiritual world through enlightened individuals. And because the belief is, the tradition is that these spiritually enlightened individuals actually do know what's best for everyone, and so their authority is sound. You know, they are just, they are compassionate, they are righteous, they do know what's best, which, of course, in today's world, that's essentially unheard of. Like, why would you trust your government to know what's best for you? That doesn't make any sense. Most politicians are idiots. They only care about money and power. And yeah, in today's world, that's correct, because we live in the Dark Age, where spiritual knowledge is greatly diminished. So when you descend from a golden age down to a silver age, you kind of get less spiritual enlightenment going on. People's consciousness begins to shrink a little bit. So if you think of those four castes, the aristocracy, the military, the economic class, and then the common people, when you go into a silver age, the military class overthrows the aristocracy. So now the enlightened aristocracy is one level below the military class, and now the military class is kind of running the show. This is like the beginning of an inversion of the caste system, and now you'll have more militaristic thinking. You'll just have less enlightened thinking and more militaristic thinking, and this is when you have an obsession with things like honor and conquest in a silver age. But ideally, in a true silver age, you'll still have like the military conquest in the name of some deity or other, or in the name of someone's spiritual enlightenment. Like, you know, you'll have like people who believe that a military activity is like a spiritual activity. Like in ancient Roman civilization, like there was like a micro silver age in there. And that's another thing. Civilizations can experience micro golden age, silver age, bronze age, dark age. Even though the whole world is like experiencing just one of these ages, the civilizations within that world will experience sort of mini collapses or mini descents, cycles within cycles, as the Mayans call it. But anyway, for instance, you can look in Roman history, the military leaders, if they felt they were kind of outmatched before a battle or during a battle, the general or whoever the ranking officer was would do a magic ritual to some deity or other, usually Mars, and then he would sacrifice himself in the ranks of the enemy. So he would perform this sort of elaborate ritual, which sometimes took an entire day to perform, and then he would paint himself in a sort of red, muddy body paint and run screaming into the enemy ranks. And he would fight a little bit, as much as he could, but he knew he would be overwhelmed and killed. And this usually had the effect of demoralizing and terrifying the enemy, because people really believed in that sort of stuff. It wasn't just superstitious. It was like an everyday belief that that sort of thing worked. And because everybody believed this, it had a real effect, and the enemy would become demoralized and terrified, and now the rest of the Roman military would actually have a chance at defeating the enemy. That's kind of Silver Age thinking. And then when you descend into a Bronze Age, the merchant class will then overthrow the military class. So in a Bronze Age, you have the economic class on top, with the military class below them, and the aristocracy below them, and then the common people. So then the aristocracy becomes like a middle-class bourgeoisie, and then the economic class rules the interests of the world. And we can see that in our civilization. I'm not saying that we live in a Bronze Age, but we do live in an age that's a micro Bronze Age within the Dark Age, within the Iron Age here, where the economic class rules our civilization. The economy is seen as the most important aspect of human life. People think the economy is the highest aspect of reality. Everything should be ordered toward the economy and by the economy. We see justice in terms of economic distribution. We see freedom in terms of how much money you have. We see political access in terms of how much money you have or how much you can bribe. We see power in terms of how much money you have or how big your corporation is, how many people you employ, how many private military officers can you hire to build an army using money. These are our measure of power and freedom and success and things like that. And that's because we no longer believe in spiritual things. So we don't order our lives toward spiritual principles. We order our lives toward economic principles. So nobody cares about enlightenment or overcoming emotions and using your spirit to think instead of your material thinking. These things don't occur to people anymore. What people care about is making money, is working, is getting money, is cheating the system, trying to get money, because we see the economy as the highest good. And we order all of our institutions of civilization based on economic principles. We even go to war or not based on how much money can be made off of it and who makes this money and who spends this money. Those are like, the decisions for going to war are not spiritual decisions. They're not even defense decisions. They're not even honorable decisions anymore. They're just economic decisions. That's the characteristic of a sort of Bronze Age. And then the characteristics of a Dark Age is when the lowest caste of the common people then overthrow the economic caste. And now you have the common people who rule over the economic class, who rules over the military class, who rules over the aristocracy. And now in a Dark Age, Iron Age or Kali Yuga, you have a complete inversion of a properly ordered, normal hierarchy. Now you have the common people ruling everything. Then this is when you have systems that we call democracy or communism, which are really the same thing. Well, one will eventually lead to the other. As Evola says, liberalism leads to capitalism, capitalism leads to democracy, democracy leads to socialism, socialism leads to radicalism, radicalism leads to communism. So as soon as you have liberalism, you've already pushed the ball down the hill toward communism. And it's like a domino effect or a slippery slope or whatever you want to call it. Once you start introducing liberalistic ideology into your civilization, that's when you know your civilization is on its way out. It's only got a few centuries left, and it'll be done probably within 3 to 5 centuries after you introduce liberalism, especially after you introduce capitalism and democracy. You're going to go downhill. This is my problem with modern conservatives, is that they believe capitalism is a right-wing system and is somehow the opposite of communism. This is a complete delusion. Capitalism is a leftist system. By definition, capitalism is left of center because it is a liberalistic system. And liberalism came after the French Revolution, when the aristocrats and the military orders were overthrown by the economic class. And after the French Revolution, Western civilization has been dominated by the economic class, and in some instances has been dominated by the common people class, especially in places like Eastern Europe and Russia, where there was the Bolshevik Revolution and communism took hold for about 73 years, where, quote unquote, the people ruled. But of course we know it wasn't the people, it was the animalistic instincts of people who ruled. And the sort of dark intelligence, the sort of dark forces of reality sort of took over people's minds and made them perform all kinds of violent and tyrannical decisions under communism, because the people don't know how to control themselves. The masses of people, you can get individuals who obviously can become spiritually enlightened and control themselves, but then that individual ascends to become an aristocrat in the traditional sense of Julius Evola, where the aristocrat is a spiritually enlightened individual who has overcome their emotions, who has overcome their lower thinking, who has had the transcendental experience, and now they really do know what's best for society. So yeah, aristocrats obviously come from the common people. Everything comes from the common people, as long as it's essentially coming from the spiritual world. And the spiritual world impulses descend into the common people, and the common people order their lives toward the spiritual world, and then you will get individuals who can ascend the hierarchy in a proper meritorious way. But when you just have political upheaval and the people just decide they're in power, they really don't know what's best for themselves. They don't know what's best for civilization. These people, they make shoes, they pave roads, they do these things, and that's great. We need them, and they're great people. I'm not belittling, I have a very menial job. I'm not belittling people with menial jobs. I just mean, what do we know about what's best for civilization? What does, some, baker know about, international military relations? You know what I mean? How does he know what to vote for? How does he know who's going to be best at legislation, and who's going to be best at regulating military procedures and stuff like that? These people have, most people don't have any idea of how the world works, of how reality works, and yet they believe they have a right to control civilization, they have the right to vote, they have a right to have a voice, and it's in my opinion, it's absolute nonsense. And so you have a dark age will ensue when the caste system is inverted like this, because now you really have no higher principles governing these people. You just have their own animalistic whims, and there's no aristocracy, there's no enlightened aristocracy to show them spiritual principles. They have no role models, essentially. And once they're in power, they have no reason to improve themselves, because they have all the political power, they have all the money. So why should they bother improving themselves? They're at the top of the heap. They're the king of the hill. There's no more spiritual principles being developed within individuals during a democratic civilization or a communistic civilization. When modern conservatives today say that capitalism is somehow the antithesis of communism, they're fooling themselves. Spirituality is the antithesis of communism, because communism is materialistic, and so is capitalism. They came after the French Revolution, when the merchant class decided they're going to rule, and the economic system became the most important aspect of reality, and spiritual principles lost their position as being the highest good. And that's where capitalism came from, believing that civilization should be ordered toward economic principles. Capitalism, by definition, is a leftist system. If you wanted to get to a right system, a centrist or right system, or a properly ordered system, you would have to subordinate economy to spiritual principles. Spiritual principles must be elevated again toward the highest good, and the economy should be secondary or tertiary. It should be a secondary or tertiary concern. And the aristocrats should really be managing. The aristocrats, the spiritually enlightened aristocrats. I'm not just talking about aristocrats in the way that most modern people think of that word, as just a bunch of rich people who think they know best. No, I'm talking about enlightened people who actually do know best, which the world has not seen for thousands of years. So when I say aristocrat, you might have a mistaken idea of what I mean. An aristocrat has not set foot on this planet in thousands of years. So you probably really don't know what I mean. Someone who has had the transcendental experiences is an aristocrat. If you have not had the transcendental spiritual experiences, you are not an aristocrat. You're bloodline, your wealth, and your political access do not make you an aristocrat. That's not what I'm talking about. So basically, a way of looking at this from a psychological or spiritual point of view is that each age kind of has its own religious impulse. In a golden age, you have solar impulses. In a silver age, you have lunar impulses. In a bronze age, you have chthonic or telluric impulses. And then in a dark age, you'll have materialist impulses. So this means that in a golden age, the solar spiritual impulse is essentially transcendent identification with the Most High, absolute reality. To modern religious thinkers, this is absolute heresy. To say things like, I am God, and you are God, and God is within you, and you can realize this, self-realization, realizing that you are the Most High, that you are the Paramatma, that you are Shiva, you are Brahma, you are Vishnu, you are the Tao. Like, that's a solar golden age, essentially responsibility or an impulse. When you can achieve enlightenment, true moksha, true spiritual liberation, you are identified with the Most High reality and you realize you are no different from it. That's like the most perfect kind of spiritual aristocrat or spiritually enlightened individual will have achieved that consciousness. In a silver age, you have what you could call a lunar religion, or the religions of devotion, which is where you're really no longer identified with the Most High principle, but now you worship the Most High principle. Now you believe God is like outside of you, and it's kind of feminine because now your soul is perceived as being feminine and the deity outside of you is conceived as being masculine, and you consider your soul to be like the beloved of the deity. And now you're in this devotional state of bhakti yoga, devotional yoga. This is where most religions kind of stand in the world. Most religions are pretty lunar. Even though we live in a dark age, there are still lunar religions out there. Most of the world religions are lunar religions in that deity is seen as outside of you and you worship that. When you move into a Bronze Age, you get chthonic or telluric religious impulses. And basically, chthonic, telluric, these words are synonyms essentially. They mean like earthly, the sort of earth god religions. In ancient cultures, especially in ancient Greek, you'll have people who like go underground to do their religious ceremonies. They believe that when you die, your soul goes to the underworld instead of the above world. In a more solar or lunar sense, it's more Olympian or heavenly, where the gods live in the sky, or there's an upward impulse to solar and lunar religions. And the chthonic religions are earthly, underground, earth gods. And this is where you get like the witchcraft and the really feminine religions, like the feminist religions. If lunar religions are feminine, chthonic and telluric religions are feminist in nature. It's sort of the earth mother and the goddess worship, and it's no longer transcendent. It's more about life force energy, and it's becoming more and more materialistic, the religious impulse, as you get into a Bronze Age. And you can look at all the witchcraft traditions and that sort of thing, and sort of the Celtic Druidic tradition. These are very chthonic and telluric, and they just have all these sort of, they might call them dark gods, where the Olympian or upward impulses are no longer really recognized. These chthonic religious systems are basically more about how can these deities benefit you? How can these earth gods do something in your life to get you more money, to make a beautiful woman fall in love with you, to curse or hex somebody, to destroy or kill somebody? And it becomes a much more selfish, and it's more concerned with this life and not spiritual life. It's much more concerned with material life, these religious impulses. This is where you also get like the fertility gods and all that sort of stuff that James Frazer talks about in his Golden Bough. That's all very chthonic, telluric. This kind of brings people to thinking about primitive religious systems like shamans and witch doctors, what people call indigenous or primitive people. The thing is that this is a misnomer. When you begin studying this type of history, the cycles of time, you realize that primitive people that are around today are not primitive, in the sense that primitive meaning primary. In an evolutionary sense, primitive means like the first thing that we all come from. So like primitive people are in early stages of development and have not developed as far as we have, you know, scientifically or technologically or civilly or whatever. This is actually not true. They're not primitive people. They are leftovers from a more advanced civilization. And some of these civilizations are so old that they're not in our historical records. You know, you can think of things like Atlantis or Lemuria or whatever, or even other civilizations that have been utterly eradicated from any records, any oral tradition, any historical tradition whatsoever. Primitive people are actually leftovers. They used to have a sophisticated civilization, and they've degenerated into the state that they're in now, which is why they have the chthonic religious systems. The shamanic religious system is very chthonic or telluric, very earth god based. And it's because they used to have solar and lunar religious impulses, and nowadays they have chthonic impulses because they lost their higher, more sophisticated civilization. And so primitive people today are actually in the last stages of decline of, you know, tens of thousands of years of history that or even hundreds of thousands of years that are just not recorded, that we have no evidence, physical evidence for. But of course, people who have accessed the Akashic record, people who have accessed the initiatic traditions that I'm discussing, these things become known to you in an intuitive sense, that these are not primitive people, they are leftovers from previously advanced civilizations. Then as you get into the Dark Age, the Iron Age, or Kali Yuga, the religious impulses become materialistic, where consciousness has shrunken so much, you know, where in a golden age your consciousness is like a bright star, and then it shrinks down, and now in a dark age your consciousness will be like a barely burning coal, and our minds are just 5 sense oriented. We can't see anything besides what our 5 senses can detect of the material world. In earlier ages, we had an atavistic clairvoyance. You know, a lot of philosophers, especially Rudolf Steiner, will tell you about our atavistic clairvoyance that we had in the past, where people could actually see spiritual phenomena all around them all the time. In a dark age, we don't even have that anymore. So our religious impulses become extremely materialistic. We call it science, but it's just a religious impulse. The idea of trying to discover the origins of reality and how reality works, this is religion. Religion meaning to bind to the source or to connect to the source is essentially what religion means in Latin. When you have only 5 sense oriented material consciousness and you basically feel very disconnected from the spiritual world. Even though you're not, you feel that you are, you perceive that you are. And this leads to modern scientific thinking and economic thinking that I've discussed. And a characteristic symptom of this is the degeneration of language, whereas language and speaking in general used to always be a sacred act, and words have very deep meanings. In a materialistic world, or in a dark age, language no longer has any sacred meaning to it whatsoever, and we actually forget the origins of most words. And we use sacred words all day, every day. Almost every word we have has a sacred origin, but we've forgotten these origins, and now we just think of them in these mundane words. You know, a pretty good example is the word hygiene. It's a Greek word. In Greek, hygiene actually means when everything is in correct proportion and is in harmony with itself. So a hygienic person is someone who knows how to take care of the physical body, the astral body, the etheric body, the spiritual body, and their mind. They have a well-ordered life that all aspects of their life are in harmony with each other and in proper proportion. That's what hygiene means. Today, hygiene just means you brush your teeth and wash yourself, you know? And people have no idea the actual meaning of the word hygiene. There are so many of these words out there. You use them in almost every sentence you speak. It would take an entire few months to go through all of these words and their true sacred origins, but just take any word at all and study its etymology, And not just the etymology that you find on dictionary.com, which says, well, this word is from this language, and then they end it there. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. How did that language come up with it? So you got to get deeper. Real etymology is an intuitive art, and you have to go back to the sacred scriptures, especially the ones written in Sanskrit, which is arguably the oldest language. And also in Hebrew, you can find the sacred origins of these words. Just look for words that kind of sound like what you're saying. Look for the Sanskrit and Hebrew versions of them, and look at their traditional use in those ancient religious traditions. And you'll find more of the sacred origins of these words, and you'll see how degenerate the civilization we live in today, the way we use these words in such corrupt and profane ways, it might surprise you. And that's how you know that you live in a dark age, is when you only perceive material phenomena and you don't know the meanings of the words you use. So this, to me, is proof positive that we are in fact living in the Iron Age, the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age. To me, it's incontrovertible proof. So, like I said earlier, some philosophers believe that, well, just a couple philosophers, Yogananda and Yukteswar Giri, believe that you slowly ascend out of a dark age back toward a golden age by going through the bronze, silver, and toward the golden. Whereas most traditions will say, no, there's going to be a great catastrophe at the end of Kali Yuga, and then it sort of just resets. The earth just kind of refreshes itself in an inexplicable cosmic manner. Not a political manner, not an economic manner, not a technological manner. This is what people think of when they think of a golden age. They think of like a technological golden age or a political golden age, what we call a utopia, based on like human ingenuity or something. This isn't strictly true. It's true in the superficial sense that, like, yeah, you will see that. You will see different technologies that are used responsibly. You will see better political systems that have real justice and benefit. And they will seem like they are human innovations, that they came from the minds of humans. But really, these are impulses from the spiritual world that humanity carries out and recreates a new golden age after some sort of catastrophe. So in the grand scheme of things, history is really not linear. History, as we know it, has only been around for about 150 years. The idea of recording history and maybe about 200 years, and researching history, researching things in the past in an archaeological or linear fashion. What we call, the science of history or the discipline of history is only 200 years old. Previous cultures did not really do this. They didn't track down things in the past in the way we do. They kept stories with them. They kept mythologies with them. Even up until the 18th century, they were not like, there were no historians, really. I mean, you can talk about people like Pliny in ancient Rome and people like that who kind of were proto-historians, but even then, they're just writing down the old stories and mythologies into a book, and I guess that makes them a historian, but they weren't really like doing much research other than like talking to Egyptian priests and stuff like that. They weren't like looking for documents and archaeological dig sites or anything like that. That's a very new phenomenon. What we call the science of history is an infantile science. It's not clear, it's not well developed, it misses the spiritual element completely, it misses human psychology completely. When people want to talk about the causes of World War I, for instance, people say, oh, well, there was these treaties and there was this economic, there were these economic events happening over the last 50 years, and there are these political events that were happening, and then there were these, social movements occurring, and all these things came together and started World War I. But what they don't tell you is that, like, well, what about the world leaders at the time? Like George III and Nicholas II and, his good friend Rasputin, and like all these world leaders, Kaiser Wilhelm, like they lost their minds all at the same time. You can look like they all became incompetent, paranoid, freaked out by like sounds that they heard. Some of them would lock themselves in their rooms for days at a time. In the months leading up to World War I, like all these world leaders and just a handful of people, they all started losing their minds at the same time. And historians kind of completely ignore that because they just want to look at documents and treaties and correspondences between diplomats and crap like that and economic data and stuff like that. But it's like the decision makers who started World War I were all paranoid freaks all at the same time. What happened? What were these impulses that were making them all go crazy at the same time? That were making them all afraid of their neighbors and wanting to go to war with each other all at the same time? History doesn't have any idea of how to deal with things like that. There are many episodes of history that are like that. I mean, you can look at the end of the 1990s and the lead up to the disaster in New York City, and you had the same thing. You had all, like, the historians look for, again, they look for the data. They look for this terrorist organization, and they look for that economic data. They look for what happened in the 80s with military interventions in the Middle East, and they try to blame all these things together. But they don't talk about the absolute madness and paranoia going on in the politicians' minds at the time. The desire for domination that they all felt all at the same time, and how these various world leaders who all had intense desires for domination suddenly well up within them, then clash with each other. They don't, historians have no idea how to deal with that sort of stuff. And they don't deal with that sort of stuff because science is materialistic and doesn't really pay attention to those sorts of impulses that come from the spiritual world. Again, this is how you know you live in a dark age, when spirituality is completely ignored and we have these half-completed sciences. These sciences that only pay attention to physics and materialism and just historical documents and nothing else. Even materialists know that, it got really bright in here, that something's missing. And even materialists have their messianic religions. Like I was describing, Vishnu will incarnate as Kalki, an avatar who will end the Dark Age and bring about like a golden age. Even the materialists have their idea of the Messiah. You have the transhumanists who believe in the singularity, like technologists and transhumanists. They believe in the idea of the singularity, the technological singularity, which is, they believe that at a certain point in the future, technology will advance in an exponential way, not a linear way, but technological advancements get like more and more rapid and accelerated. So at a point in the future, technological advances will happen to an infinite degree in an infinitely short period of time, and that this is what's known as a technological singularity. And this is when they believe like the great universal artificial intelligence will awaken and humanity will merge with the machine, and all diseases will be cured and the lifespan will be immortal and the universe will change shape and all that sort of stuff when the technological singularity occurs. And so even materialists have a messianic religion. But they don't call it that because they believe that they're like more correct, that they have more reasonable beliefs in science, and that they're not superstitious like those people who believe in religion. But of course, anyone with a brain knows better than that. They are superstitious nut jobs. They do have a bizarre dogmatic religious system that is only based on perceiving a small portion of reality, only the material portion of reality, completely ignoring all other aspects of reality. They completely ignore paranormal anomalies because there are no scientific laws to describe these paranormal anomalies, so they just pretend like these anomalies don't exist, or that we just haven't found the scientific law to describe it yet. And even that's an assumption. How do you know you'll find a repeatable scientific law to describe these things? You don't know that you will, but they believe they will. They believe, oh, one day in the future, science will help us understand everything. But you can't say it. You don't know that that's true. You do not know that you're going to find a repeatable scientific law to explain certain paranormal phenomena. That's an a priori assumption. And any philosopher knows you are not capable of making a priori assumptions. It's not allowed in terms of logic and intuition. You cannot determine something until you know it. So claiming that science will eventually find out everything is a religious, dogmatic belief. It is not a truth. It's just a belief. This is the religion of a dark age, is this scientific religion. And it's like a perverted mirror image of true religion or true spirituality. It's like an inverted version of it. Because it's so anti-traditional and anti-spiritual, it cannot sustain itself and it cannot sustain the human race. And this is what will lead to the great catastrophe at the end of the Dark Age. It will be this materialistic religious impulse that will eventually clash with the needs of the human race. The needs will not be addressed on these materialistic impulses. Only spiritual impulses, because they are in line with true reality, will meet the needs of humanity. Materialistic impulses, because they're based on only a partial view of reality, an incomplete view, and in some instances even an incorrect view. But in many instances they're still correct. Materialistic sciences are correct, they're just extremely incomplete. They only show you like 10 to 20% of reality and ignore the vast majority of reality. So they're true in their own domain, but they're very small and incomplete, and therefore will not meet the needs of humanity going into the future, which will lead to the catastrophe. But it will also lead to people seeking what truly does meet those needs. And that is when people will once again rediscover their sort of clairvoyance, their intuition, and their spiritual principles that they have disregarded since the so-called Age of Enlightenment. There's always that way out for individuals. You don't have to wait for all of society to discover these spiritual principles. You can discover them on your own at any time, no matter whether you're in a golden age or a dark age or anything in between. Individuals who have enough discipline and determination and self-control can always overcome whatever the greater civilization is going through. You don't have to collapse with your society. You can rise above these things. You can have internal freedom. You can have spiritual liberation as an individual. And yeah, it's a lonely path. Most people, especially in a dark age, are not going to understand you. They're going to think you're the enemy. They're going to think you're delusional. They're going to think you're crazy. They're going to think you're some kind of madman or stupid or weird. But you will be on the correct path and they will not be. So as they're all steamrolling off the cliff, you're going to be fine. You're going to be tranquil. You're going to be on your way to enlightenment. And the current age you're in does not determine the destiny of individuals. Any individual can overcome any adversity that's going on in the external world. So keep that in mind. Know that a healthy order to your life is to organize your willpower, your thoughts and your feelings and your actions toward the above, toward the spiritual principles, and allow those spiritual principles to organize your life. And you'll be fine. You'll overcome any obstacles. And the descent of the ages toward a catastrophe does not have to bring you any fear. It's just a natural thing. It's just like anything is born, grows, reaches a peak, starts to get old, and then dies. That happens to people, it happens to animals, it happens to trees, it even happens to rocks, it happens to stars, it happens to entire galaxies, and it happens to civilizations. And it has to happen. It's not something that needs to be avoided. It's part of our spiritual development, it's part of our growth as a species. It's something that we have to go through. It's something that in the long run will be good for us, even though we suffer in the meantime. So it's nothing to be afraid of, it's nothing to rail against, it's nothing to freak out about or lose any sleep over. It's just a natural part of life, the descent of the ages and the catastrophes that occur from time to time, and the decline and degeneracy of psychology and spiritual principles. It's all natural. It really is, at least for this world, for three-dimensional existence. It's just what happens. And it's best to just take that with grace and follow your own spiritual disciplines to overcome the degeneracy and to liberate yourself from any perversions or degeneracy that are going on in your world, to have that internal freedom, even though as the world declines more and more, our external freedoms are removed. Every day we see it. Our external freedoms are infringed upon, are removed, and just taken away from us. And our only recourse is inner spiritual freedom. And again, it's all natural, it's all fine. Don't be depressed about it. We all know these things, like people who understand these initiatic traditions. We've been dealing with this stuff for hundreds of thousands of years as a species. And we're still here. We've experienced many dark ages, many catastrophes, and we still come out the other side. And you will too. So, thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned something from this lecture, and have a good day.